Nosso último palestrante dessa manhã é um grande parceiro IBRAMED. É com grande prazer que convido o Dr. Alex Ward, criador da corrente Aussie, para abordar o tema sobre as origens da corrente Aussie.
Well, thank you. It's very good to be here today. And I'd like to thank my friends from IBRAMED for bringing me out here to talk to you. I'd also like to thank IBRAMED for actually producing Aussie currents. I'm going to give you some history of the origins of our Aussie currents today. But perhaps one thing I should say is that when I actually took the idea of Aussie currents to Australian manufacturers, none of them were interested because they thought it was going to compete with their existing products. So I was very fortunate to meet with IBRAMED and have them actually become interested in my work and the idea of Aussie currents. Okay, well, I guess I'm repeating a little bit what's already been said. Electrical stimulation, as you know, can be used for various purposes: pain control, reduction of edema, muscle re-education, prevention of disuse atrophy, strengthening, and so on. And my particular interest has been in the mechanism of muscle contraction and the actual processes that are occurring with sensory stimulation. And also to what extent the effects that we see are due to the actual changes that are occurring in the muscle fibers themselves, as distinct from changes that are occurring in the central nervous system. As has already been mentioned, there are basically two types of current that are used clinically. Low frequency pulse current, 50 hertz in the example on the left, and bursts of medium frequency, that is kilohertz frequency, alternating current, sometimes referred to as MFAC, just medium frequency alternating current. So to begin with some of the history, well, the very first alternators were invented in around the 1890s, and a French scientist by the name of D'Arsonval decided that he would use an alternator on himself and see what effect the electric current has. Alternators now are found in everybody's motor car. The idea is that you spin the alternator and it produces alternating current, which then has to be converted into direct current to charge up the car battery. So D'Arsonval in the 1890s used the so-called Gram alternator, and simply by varying the speed of rotation of the alternator, you can produce different frequencies of alternating current. And with the early alternators, the maximum speed that you could actually spin them before the machine self-destructed was about 2,500 times per second. So the maximum alternating current frequency that could be produced was up around the 2.5 kilohertz mark. D'Arsonval also used electrical oscillator circuits to produce much higher frequencies of the order of 100 kilohertz. So basically what he was doing is working with alternating current, and his work was simply using continuous alternating current and looking at the effects on the human body. He described tetany in human subjects at alternating current frequencies of 10 to 15 hertz, and an increasing response as the alternating current frequency was increased up to 1250 to 2500 hertz. Above these frequencies, then the effects just became less and less, so that by the time you get up to a frequency of many tens of kilohertz or 100 kilohertz, then there's no physiological response. And D'Arsonval actually demonstrated this by producing alternating current at a frequency of 100 kilohertz, and he had a group of people standing in a circle. He had the generator connected with one person holding onto the generator and everyone holding hands in a circle, and one person holding an electric light bulb. And what he was able to demonstrate that at those frequencies there was no physiological response, although there was certainly a lot of current flowing, in the sense that the electric light bulb lit up quite brightly. So with very high frequencies then, there's no excitatory response produced as such, but what he did notice is that you can get analgesia produced, which persists for between 1 and 20 minutes. And he also reported that a couple of his friends were using very high frequency alternating current to actually produce analgesia so that they could perform surgery and extract teeth. He also described the electric chair, which had been recently adopted in New York State, as barbarous and unholy, not because it actually killed them, but because it took such a long time. The voltages that they were using were simply too low, about 1,500 volts. Now, as has already been mentioned, Koch reported strength gains in Russian athletes and claimed huge increases. But that was, has been pointed out, fairly early in the piece, before of the restrictions on pharmaceutical agents for strengthening. Essentially, Russian currents are applied with a burst duration of 50%. That is, if the frequency is 50 hertz, then there'll be a 10 millisecond burst of alternating current, followed by a 10 millisecond gap before the next burst actually appeared. But one thing that should be pointed out is that Koch's choice of 2.5 kilohertz for Russian current was fairly arbitrary. He didn't give any particular reason for choosing this frequency, although possibly he'd read the early French work and knew that you could produce a reasonable amount of force with relatively little discomfort. The actual burst duration was arbitrary. Originally, Kotz's group was using continuous alternating current, and what they found was that if they actually reduced it to a 50% duty cycle, then it made virtually no difference. So Kotz popularized Russian current, and there was later work carried out by Bankov, who compared 1, 2, and 5 millisecond rectangular 60 hertz bursts of 5 kilohertz alternating current. So Bankoff was actually challenging whether the actual burst duration that Kotz had recommended was optimal. And what he reported, and the way he was carrying out these experiments was by stimulating the biceps and turning up the intensity to the point where the arm was maintained at 90 degrees of flexion at the elbow. In other words, an anti-gravity flexion level of muscle contraction. And what he was able to demonstrate was that if he used a burst duration of 1 millisecond, then that was actually most comfortable for producing that response. He also studied variations on alternating current waveforms, comparing unmodulated current with fully modulated current, as used in interferential machines. And he also used hypermodulated current, where the current was actually modulated to the point where it was zero in between bursts, and hypomodulated, where the current was decreasing but not decreasing to zero. What he found was that the associated discomfort showed very little variation, but the actual amount of force was increased with the hypermodulated current. So really, Bankoff laid the groundwork for using shorter duration bursts of alternating current than Kotz had been using traditionally. So what do we know about kilohertz frequency alternating current? Some of what we know is purely anecdotal. Some of it is assumptions. For example, kilohertz frequency AC is claimed to be more comfortable than pulse current. It's claimed to be more depth effective due to a lower skin impedance. And of course, there's the traditional idea that Russian currents are best for actual strengthening. The first of these assumptions is certainly correct. Kilohertz frequency alternating current is extremely comfortable, particularly if it's in the range 2.5 to 5 kilohertz. The idea that it's more effective due to lower skin impedance is simply not true. Essentially, the thing that determines skin impedance is the actual duration of each pulse of current. And in the case of pulse current and kilohertz frequency alternating current, the actual pulses are about the same and the skin impedance is about the same. And then the claim that Russian currents are best for strengthening has been shown to be, well, certainly not true. So I became interested in force production and discomfort using kilohertz frequency alternating current. And one of the earliest pieces of work that we did was to simply vary the kilohertz frequency and measure how much torque was produced. And this involved having a person's arm strapped in a dynamometer to measure the force. And what we did was vary the frequency of the alternating current, turning it up to an intensity which the subject reported as maximum tolerable. And what we found was that as you increase the frequency from 1 kilohertz to 15 kilohertz, then the actual amount of force that's produced gets progressively less and less. So this suggested then that for maximum force production, a kilohertz frequency of around 1 kilohertz is probably preferable to 2.5 kilohertz or 5 kilohertz. But we only measured frequencies down to 1 kilohertz because we were assuming that we were going to get maximum force production at maybe 2 kilohertz, 4 kilohertz, 5 kilohertz or whatever. So this really raised the question of what happens below 1 kilohertz, and does the duty cycle make any difference, and is there a significant variation in the amount of discomfort? So, a report that we published in 2004 was a study that we did where we actually varied the frequency of the alternating current from 0.5 kilohertz up to 20 kilohertz, and where we varied the duty cycle, that is effectively the burst duration of the alternating current. And what we found was that the optimal frequency, as far as force production is concerned, is pretty close to 1 kilohertz. And as far as the actual duty cycle or burst duration is concerned, then a relatively short burst duration, that is a duty cycle of around 10% or so, was optimal from the point of view of force production. So it was essentially this then that gave me the idea that if it's maximum force production that you want, and if you want to minimize the amount of discomfort associated with the alternating current, then, well, an optimum frequency of about 1 kilohertz is best for muscle strengthening, and an optimum duty cycle of about 10%, corresponding to only a few milliseconds bursts of alternating current were best. We also looked at discomfort at different frequencies and found that as far as the lowest frequencies are concerned, well, once you get below about 1 kilohertz, then it starts to become very uncomfortable. The actual amount of discomfort decreases as you increase the frequency up to about 4 kilohertz. And then if you increase the frequency above 4 kilohertz, then what you find is that the discomfort increases. So, in the case of interferential therapy, it operates at a frequency typically of 4 or 5 kilohertz, and in terms of discomfort, then that's a pretty good frequency to be using. As far as discomfort was concerned, what we found was that if you use a fairly short burst duration, that is a fairly short duty cycle, then the discomfort was fairly small, and that as you increase the duty cycle to 100%, in other words, continuous alternating current, then the amount of discomfort increases quite dramatically. So, in terms of discomfort then, a frequency of around 4 kilohertz appears to be optimum, and a duty cycle of 20 to 25%, in other words, a few milliseconds, burst duration is optimal. Whoops. So the conclusion that we came to was that as far as force production was concerned, 1 kilohertz frequency AC applied in bursts with a 2 millisecond burst duration is optimal. At first, we thought it was the actual duty cycle that was important, but then with later work that we did, we established that it was actually the duration of that burst that was important, not the duty cycle as such. So in terms of force production then, 1 kilohertz frequency AC applied in bursts with a 2 millisecond duration appears to be optimal. And as far as discomfort is concerned, then a frequency of 4 kilohertz AC applied in bursts with a 4 millisecond burst duration appears to be optimal. So the particular frequency that we choose and the actual burst duration depend on the actual results that we want to achieve. In other words, do we want to produce maximum force, or are we interested in using a form of electrical stimulation that's relatively comfortable? And of course, that's going to depend on who we're treating. If, say, we're talking about, say, an old, injured patient who doesn't tolerate electric current very well, then we go for a frequency of 4 kilohertz and a relatively long burst duration. That's not going to produce maximum force, but at least it's not going to be as unpleasant for the patient. On the other hand, if we're treating an athlete who wants to increase their muscle force, then generally they will tolerate relatively high intensities of electric current, and they'll put up with relatively high stimulation intensities at frequencies of 1 kilohertz and relatively short burst durations. So what we would choose then is going to depend on the subject that we are dealing with and also the effects that we're trying to achieve. As I mentioned, burst duration is probably more important than duty cycle, and that's because of summation, multiple firing, and fibre dropout, something I was going to say a little bit more about very soon. When you've got a burst of alternating current, then there's the possibility of summation and multiple firing. So in other words, if I'm using a burst of alternating current and I turn up the intensity, then what happens is that each little pulse within that burst partially depolarizes the nerve. So during that burst of alternating current, what we've got is the nerve being pushed closer and closer to threshold until eventually it fires and we've got an action potential. But if I was to turn up the intensity, then what I'd find is that we don't need as many pulses to push the nerve above threshold and produce an action potential. So if I was to gradually increase the intensity, then the action potential would be produced earlier, and we could get to the point where an action potential is produced, the nerve recovers, and another action potential is produced during that burst. So if those bursts were being applied at a frequency of, say, 50 hertz, then if we turn up the intensity, all of a sudden we'll be generating action potentials at a frequency of 100 hertz. And if I was to turn up the intensity even more, then we could get to the point where we have, say, 3 action potentials per burst, and so on. So, going back to what was said earlier about the fatigue rate that occurs with rushing current, my theory is that the reason that we get such a rapid rate of fatigue is because we've got 10 millisecond bursts of alternating current. We're using relatively high intensities to produce a high muscle force, and even though the burst frequency is 50 hertz, the actual nerve fibers are actually firing at much higher frequencies. Some might be firing at 50 hertz, some at 100, some at 150, and consequently we're going to get a much more rapid rate of fatigue. So if we shorten that burst duration, then what we're going to be able to do is to eliminate multiple firing, meaning that if the bursts are being applied at a frequency 50 hertz, then we'll be getting 50 action potentials per second. So as far as force production is concerned, if we use a frequency of 1 kilohertz and a 2 millisecond burst duration, then with a 2 millisecond burst duration, what we're going to find is that we simply haven't got enough time for the nerve fiber to fire multiple times. So what we'll be doing is actually generating action potentials 50 times per second, and consequently generating force and avoiding the very rapid rate of fatigue that you get with Russian currents. In the case of discomfort, as I said, we established that a frequency of 4 kilohertz was the most comfortable, at least a frequency of around 4 kilohertz, and that's because we're talking about a phase duration, each one of those little pulses within the burst, of about 125 microseconds. And as I'm sure you know, with the short pulse duration or short phase duration, we get relatively more comfort, and as we make the phase duration longer, then the stimulation becomes more uncomfortable, even though we can produce more force. So the short phase durations are consistent with the reported TENS phase durations, and the burst duration is short enough to avoid multiple firing. So, having established what are the optimal frequencies and optimal burst durations, we then looked at force production and discomfort, comparing different commercially available stimulators. So again, with our subjects, we were putting electrodes on the forearm, asking them to turn up the intensity to maximum tolerable, and what we found was that if we compared Aussie current with pulse current duration 200 milliseconds and pulse current duration 500 milliseconds, there's very little difference in the amount of actual force that's produced. But when we look at Russian currents, what we found was that the maximum electrically induced torque that was produced was in fact significantly less than the other forms of stimulation. So, as far as Aussie current and pulse current are concerned, then the maximum force that you can produce is pretty much the same. But when we look at discomfort, then the alternating current waveforms are significantly more comfortable. If we look at Russian current and Aussie current, two forms of alternating, medium frequency alternating current, then what we find is that the relative discomfort is quite small compared to pulse current, which is significantly higher. So even though even though there's very little difference in the amount of force that can be produced between Aussie current PC200 and PC500, then the Aussie current turns out to be better in terms of the relative comfort associated with the stimulation. So in conclusion, we could say that Russian and Aussie current, both burst modulated alternating current, are significantly more comfortable than pulse current, but there's less maximum electrically induced torque associated with Russian current, and that was because of the multiple firing that I was talking about earlier. So my conclusion was that what I called Aussie currents were best of the four in terms of force production and discomfort, and I thought that since Kotz had come up with the idea of Russian current, then since this was based on my work and I'm from Australia, then these should be called Aussie currents. The next thing I wanted to talk about was pain control, hyperalgesia. The kind of experiments that we've been doing are using the cold-induced pain experimental model, where we basically have a subject, a volunteer, sitting with their hand in warm water for a short period of time, and then we get them to take their hand out of the warm water and dunk their hand into ice cold water and time how long they actually tolerate the icy cold water. So it's a particular model that's used to induce pain. It's been used for a number of years now. Johnson and Tabberson actually did quite a bit of work in this area. It was published around 2000 and compared TENS and interferential current. And what they found was that the interferential current was what they found was that the difference looked real in the sense that TENS appeared to be better than interferential current, but what they found was that the statistical significance was 0.09, which in my book says that probably just means they didn't have enough subjects, rather than that there wasn't any real difference as such. So we carried out a similar study using a within-subject repeated measures design to give greater statistical power. And one of the first studies that we did was simply comparing interferential current and TENS, in other words, repeating the work essentially that had been done by Johnson and Tabberson. But what we were doing was exposing our subjects to both forms of current so that the person was effectively acting as their own control, rather than having an independent groups study. And what we found was that when you compare interferential current with TENS, then the TENS is appreciably more effective. So what we were doing, what this graph is showing, is the change in the pain threshold simply measured by how much longer they would actually keep their hand in the ice-cold water. And as you can see, in the case of TENS, we get quite a dramatic effect, certainly a much bigger effect than with interferential. Essentially what we've got here is during intervention and post-intervention. So what we're seeing is quite a dramatic change in the pain threshold, the cold-induced pain threshold, during the actual electrical stimulation. But as soon as we stop the electrical stimulation, then all of a sudden the change in the pain threshold drops considerably. That led me to the question of whether the difference that we were seeing there was simply due to the high burst duration of the interferential current. And that raised the question, well, okay, what if we had shorter duration bursts? So what we did then was compare Aussie currents and TENS, and all of a sudden what we found is that with the Aussie currents and the shorter burst duration, then you get pretty much the same effect as with the TENS. That is a quite dramatic increase in the pain threshold while the current is being applied, and then a dramatic drop in the increase in pain threshold immediately after the intervention. So, comparing Aussie and TENS, then what we found was that there was very little difference between them. Then what we did was compare Aussie current at a frequency of 4 kilohertz with pulse current TENS with a pulse duration of 125 microseconds. In other words, the same as the pulse duration that we are using with Aussie currents. 4 kilohertz alternating current means that each little pulse is 125 microseconds long. So what we came up with then was the conclusion that as far as the intervention effects were concerned, very little difference between TENS and burst modulated alternating current. And again, as soon as you stop the current, then all of a sudden the change in the pain threshold became much less marked, if significant at all. So our conclusions then were that by choosing the optimal burst duration frequency, best results can be obtained in terms of force production, relative discomfort, and effectiveness of hyperalgesia. So basically, my conclusion was that kilohertz frequency AC in short duration bursts, the ones that I called Aussie currents, are best. But the particular frequency and burst duration that you choose depends upon what it is that you're trying to achieve. That is, do you want maximum force production or do you want relatively comfortable stimulation? Which concludes my talk.